The dust had a color that spring. Not brown, not red, not the honest tan of good earth. It was the color of something dying, the color of a land that had forgotten how to live. Cora Branton stood in the doorway of her farmhouse, one hand resting on the frame her grandfather had built 40 years ago. The wood was dry now, cracked and splitting, starved of moisture, like everything else in Logan County, Oklahoma. She watched the taillights of the Ford disappear into the haze of the western horizon, two red eyes growing smaller and smaller until the dust swallowed them whole. Virgil was gone. He had taken the car. He had taken the savings, all $347 they had scraped together over 9 years of marriage. He had taken Della Morrison from the feed store, a woman 15 years younger than Cora, with soft hands that had never pulled a dead calf from a dying cow, or scrubbed blood from birthing sheets, or held a husband through the fever dreams of the drought. And he had left a note. The paper sat on the kitchen table, weighed down by a coffee cup that still held the dregs of his last morning in this house. Cora had read it 3 times, standing in the kitchen with the afternoon light filtering brown through windows that no longer closed properly, windows that let the dust creep in no matter how many rags she stuffed into the cracks. The note said he was sorry. The note said California had jobs. The note said she could keep the land, as if that were a kindness instead of a curse. As if 400 acres of dust that hadn't grown anything in 3 years was a gift rather than a sentence. As if staying here alone, watching the sky turn brown and the earth turn to powder was something a person would choose. Cora did not cry. She had stopped crying somewhere in the 2nd year of the drought, when the well went brackish and the water tasted of salt and something deeper, something ancient and wrong. She had stopped crying when the chickens died one by one in the heat, their bodies too light when she buried them, as if the drought had stolen even the weight of death. She had stopped crying when she realized that tears were water, and water was the most precious thing in the world, and she could not afford to waste it on a man who had already wasted everything else. She stood in the doorway and watched the dust swallow the last trace of her marriage. The haze thickened and the taillights were gone, and Virgil was gone, and 9 years of her life were gone, disappeared into the brown nothing of the western sky. Then she walked out to the broken wagon and sat on its tilted bed and tried to remember how to think. The wagon had belonged to her grandfather, Ezekiel Branton, who had come to this land in 1889 during the Great Rush. He had built it himself from white oak hauled down from Missouri, heavy planks 4 inches thick, designed for hauling wheat when wheat was still possible. The iron fittings had been forged in a blacksmith shop in Guthrie, each bolt and bracket made to last 100 years. The front axle had cracked during the last harvest, back when there was still something to harvest. That was 2 years ago now. Virgil had promised to fix it every week for 2 years, the same way he had promised to repair the barn roof, the same way he had promised to dig a new well, the same way he had promised that next year would be better, that the rain would come, that California was just a dream, and Oklahoma was home. Now the wagon sat in the yard like a wooden carcass, too heavy to move and too broken to use. The bed tilted at an angle where the cracked axle had given way, one corner resting on the ground. Weeds had grown up around the wheels in the first year, but even the weeds were dead now. Nothing grew, nothing lived, nothing moved except the dust. Cora sat on the tilted bed and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. It was barely visible through the haze, a pale orange disk that seemed smaller than it should be, weaker, as if even the sun was giving up on this place. She thought about California, she thought about water. She thought about starting over somewhere else, somewhere the rain still fell and the crops still grew, and a woman could plant a seed and watch it become something other than a broken promise. Then she thought about her grandmother's grave on the hill behind the barn. Martha Branton had been 17 years old when she followed her husband into the Oklahoma Territory. She had lived through the land rush and the Indian Wars and the fever that took her first 3 children before they could walk. She had buried those children in the red earth, and then she had buried her husband, and then she had kept living, kept farming, kept fighting, because that was what Brantons did. That was what people did who loved a piece of land more than they loved their own comfort. Martha was buried on the hill now, next to Ezekiel, next to the three small graves with no names. 4 generations of Branton had worked this ground. 4 generations had sweated and bled and died on this 400 acres of Oklahoma prairie. Cora could not leave them. It was that simple and that complicated. She could not climb into a car and drive west and leave her grandmother's bones to be buried under the dust. She could not abandon the land that her family had fought for, even if that land was trying to kill her. She could not be the Branton who gave up. The sun disappeared below the horizon and the sky turned from brown to gray to black. Cora sat on the broken wagon in the darkness, listening to the wind pick up from the west, carrying more dust. Always more dust, an endless supply of earth that had been torn from 1,000 miles of dying farmland. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the wagon until the stars came out dim and distant through the haze, and she tried to imagine what her life would look like now. A woman alone on a dead farm with no money, no car, no husband, no hope. A woman waiting to be buried by the same dust that was burying everything else. By morning, she had not found an answer, but she had found something else. She had found a cold, hard knot of determination in her chest, a feeling that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but something fiercer than both. She would not leave, and she would not die. The discovery came 3 days later when Cora finally forced herself to go through Virgil's things. He had not taken much. A single suitcase of clothes, his good boots, the pocket watch his father had given him. Everything else remained the detritus of a life-interrupted work shirts hanging in the closet, a razor by the sink, a pair of reading glasses on the nightstand next to a Bible he had never opened. Cora moved through the house like a ghost touching things that no longer belonged to anyone. The kitchen where she had cooked 10,000 meals. The bedroom where she had spent 9 years lying next to a man she thought she knew. The sitting room where they had listened to the radio in the evenings back when there was still electricity, back when the world still felt like it made sense. She found the bank book in his desk drawer. The leather cover was cracked and faded, the pages inside yellowed with age. Cora opened it with trembling fingers, already knowing what she would find, already feeling the weight of another betrayal pressing down on her chest. The account was empty, but that was not the worst part. The worst part was the dates. Virgil had not cleaned out the account on the day he left. He had been withdrawing money for months, small amounts, at first $10 here, $20 there, then larger amounts, $50, $100. The withdrawals had started in January, 4 months before he drove away with Della Morrison. 4 months of planning, 4 months of lies, 4 months of sitting across the breakfast table from her, eating the food she cooked, sleeping in the bed she made while he slowly emptied their savings and dreamed of California. Cora turned the page and found something worse. A receipt, folded and tucked into the back of the bank book, hidden like a shameful secret. A receipt from Hendricks Livestock in Oklahoma City dated 2 weeks before Virgil left. He had sold the cattle, all of them. The 12 head of beef cattle that Cora had been keeping alive through the drought, hauling water from the brackish well, scrounging feed from neighbors who had nothing to spare. The cattle she had been saving because they were the last valuable thing on the farm, the last asset that could be converted to cash if things got truly desperate. Virgil had sold them without telling her. He had pocketed the money, added it to the savings he had already stolen, and then he had driven away with another woman while Cora stood in the doorway thinking she still had something left. She had nothing. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the bank book falling from her fingers, and she stared at the wall and tried to understand the shape of her new reality. No money, no cattle, no choir, no husband. 400 acres of dust in a farmhouse that was slowly filling with dirt, and a broken wagon that would never carry wheat again. And somewhere in California, Virgil was starting a new life with the money he had stolen from her, with the woman he had chosen over her, with the future he had purchased, with her labor and her sacrifice and her trust. Cora picked up the bank book. She walked to the kitchen. She opened the door of the cook stove, and she fed the bank book to the flames, watching the leather curl and blacken, watching the pages with their careful columns of numbers turn to ash. Then she closed the stove and walked outside and sat on the broken wagon and waited for whatever was going to happen next. Mr. Hadley arrived the following afternoon. Cora heard the car before she saw it, the distant rumble of an engine cutting through the silence of the dead farm. Sound carried strangely in the dust, muffled and distorted, and for a moment she thought it might be Virgil coming back. Then she saw the black shape emerging from the brown haze, and she knew. It was a bank car, a 1932 Chevrolet, still polished, despite the dust, still gleaming with the kind of care that came from having enough money to care about appearances. The car pulled into the yard and stopped, and a man stepped out with a white handkerchief pressed to his nose. Mr. Hadley was 55 years old, with thin gray hair combed carefully over a balding scalp, in a suit that probably cost more than Cora had earned in the last year. He had been the manager of the First National Bank of Logan County for 15 years, and he had spent most of that time foreclosing on farmers who could not pay their debts. He looked at the empty yard. He looked at the dead fields stretching to the horizon. He looked at the farmhouse with its windows drifted shut with fine brown powder. And then he looked at the woman sitting on a broken wagon, her dress faded and patched, her hands rough, and calloused, her eyes as flat and hard as the land itself. "Mrs. Branton," he said, his voice muffled by the handkerchief. "I heard about your situation. I want you to know the bank is prepared to take the land off your hands, save you the trouble of watching it blow away acre by acre." Cora did not stand up. She did not offer him a seat or a glass of water, or any of the hospitality that had been bred into her since childhood. She simply looked at him with those flat, hard eyes and waited. Hadley shifted his weight, uncomfortable under her gaze. "I know this must be difficult for you, a woman alone, no resources, no prospects. It's a hard thing what your husband did. But you don't have to stay here and suffer. The bank is offering you a way out." "What would you pay?" Cora asked. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant, the voice of a woman discussing the weather or the price of eggs. Hadley laughed. It was a dry sound like dead leaves scraping across stone, a sound that matched the landscape perfectly. "Pay Mrs. Branton. This land isn't worth paying for. We'd be taking on the tax burden as a favor. You'd walk away clean, start fresh somewhere with water." "So you want me to give you 400 acres for nothing?" "I want to help you," Hadley said, and there was something in his voice that might have been genuine concern buried under layers of professional detachment. "This land is worthless. It will be worthless for years, maybe decades. The dust has killed it, and nothing is going to bring it back. You can stay here and watch it bury you, or you can sign a few papers and walk away with your life." Cora looked at the cracked earth beneath her feet. She looked at the brown haze that hung over everything, turning the afternoon sun into a pale ghost of itself. She looked at the farmhouse where she had lived for 9 years, where she had hoped to raise children, where she had imagined growing old with a man who had promised to love her until death. Then she looked at the hill behind the barn, the hill where her grandmother was buried, the hill where 4 generations of Brantons had returned to the earth they loved. "I'll stay," she said. Hadley shook his head. It was a slow movement weighted with the particular pity of a man who knows better. A man who has seen this before, who has watched stubborn people make stubborn choices, and who has learned that there is no arguing with someone who has already decided to die. "There's nothing to stay for," he said. "The house will fill with dust by winter. You'll choke on your own ceiling. I've seen it happen to better people than you, Mrs. Branton. Stronger people. People who had money and resources and family to help them. They all thought they could wait it out, and the dust buried them anyway." Cora said nothing. "You have no cattle," Hadley continued. "Your husband made sure of that before he left. You have no savings, no income, no way to buy food or fuel or anything else you need to survive. The well is brackish. The fields are dead. The house is falling apart around you. How exactly do you plan to live?" "That's my problem," Cora said. It becomes my problem when you die here and the county has to clean up the mess. Something flickered in Cora's eyes then. Something that might have been anger, or might have been something deeper and more dangerous. Then let me make this easy for you, Mr. Hadley. I am not leaving this land. I am not signing any papers. And I am not going to die. Hadley stared at her for a long moment. The wind picked up, carrying a fresh wave of dust across the yard, and he pressed the handkerchief tighter against his face. You're making a mistake, he said finally, a bad one. But it's your mistake to make. He turned and walked back to his car, his polished shoes leaving prints in the dust that the wind would erase within the hour. He opened the door and paused, looking back at her one more time. I'll be back, he said. When you change your mind, I'll be back. Then he was gone. The black car swallowed by the brown haze, the sound of the engine fading until there was nothing left but the wind and the silence and the endless patient accumulation of dust. Cora sat on the wagon until the sun went down. She sat there as the shadows lengthened and the air grew cool and the stars emerged one by one through the haze. She sat there thinking about Hadley's words, about the house filling with dust, about choking on her own ceiling. He was right about one thing. The houses were filling with dust. Every structure in the county was slowly being buried from the inside out. The wind carried dirt so fine it passed through walls, through closed windows, through the wet rags people hung over their faces. Families woke up with dunes on their kitchen tables. Children coughed black mud. The land was eating everything that stood above it. She had seen it herself just last month when she walked the 3 miles to the Henderson place to borrow a cup of flour. The Hendersons had been gone for weeks, fled to California like so many others, and their house stood empty and open to the wind. Cora had looked through the window and seen drifts of dust 2 feet deep covering the furniture, burying the chairs and the table and the beds where the Henderson children had slept. The house had looked like a tomb. Cora thought about her own house, about the dust that crept in no matter how hard she fought it, about the morning ritual of sweeping and wiping and scrubbing only to have the dust return by evening, about the way her lungs burned sometimes when the wind was strong, the way she woke up tasting grit on her tongue. She thought about the Hendersons, about all the other families who had given up and driven away. She thought about California, where the rain still fell and the river still ran, and a person could breathe without feeling like they were slowly drowning in earth. And then she thought about her grandmother's grave on the hill, and something shifted inside her. She could not leave, but she could not stay either. Not like this, not in a house that was slowly filling with dust, not on a surface that the wind was determined to bury. The idea came to her slowly rising up from some deep place in her mind, like water from a well. A crazy idea, an impossible idea, an idea that seemed like madness until she realized it was the only sane response to a world that had gone mad. If the dust was going to bury everything, she would bury herself first. She would go down before the land could push her under. The thought should have frightened her. It should have seemed desperate and foolish, the last resort of a woman who had run out of options. But sitting there on the broken wagon in the darkness, watching the stars flicker through the haze, Cora felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt hope. The old woman appeared on the 9th day. Cora had been digging since dawn, working with a pickaxe and a shovel that had belonged to her grandfather. The spot she had chosen was behind the barn, a natural low point in the terrain where the ground dipped slightly. If rain ever came again, the water would drain away from this spot rather than pooling in it. She had marked out a rectangle in the dust, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide. The dimensions of a room, the dimensions of a life. The first 2 feet were the hardest. The topsoil had baked into something like stone, cracked and fissured and resistant to every blow of the pickaxe. Cora's arms ached. Her back screamed. Her hands, already rough from years of farm work, blistered and bled and blistered again. But she kept digging. Somewhere below the dead surface, she knew the earth would remember what it used to be. Somewhere down there, the soil would be moist and dark and alive the way it had been before the drought. before the world turned brown and started dying. She was 3 feet down when she heard the sound of hooves. The old woman was leading a mule that looked as tired and worn as everything else in Logan County. The mule's ribs showed through its dusty coat and its head hung low, and it moved with the slow, patient shuffle of an animal that had learned not to expect anything good from the world. The woman was even older than the mule. Her face was a map of wrinkles, brown and weathered, and her eyes were the color of dust. She wore a faded dress that might once have been blue, and a rag wrapped around her nose and mouth to filter the air. She stopped at the edge of the hole and looked down at Cora. "You digging a grave?" she asked. Her voice was dry and cracked like the earth itself had learned to speak. Cora paused, leaning on her shovel. Sweat ran down her face, cutting channels through the dust that coated her skin. Her muscles trembled with exhaustion, and her lungs burned from breathing the thick air. "I'm digging a house," she said. The old woman was silent for a long moment. Her eyes moved across the hole, measuring the dimensions, calculating the depth. Then she looked at the broken wagon sitting nearby at the heavy oak bed that had once carried wheat at the solid planks that had been built to last 100 years. She nodded slowly as if something had been confirmed. "My grandmother lived in a dugout in Kansas," she said, "back before there were houses, back when the prairie was still wild and the buffalo still ran. She said the worst storms passed right over her head, said the earth remembers how to breathe even when the air forgets." She reached into a sack hanging from the mule's saddle and pulled out a clay jar. She set it on the ground at the edge of the hole. "Water," she said, "from my well. It's good water, deep water, the kind that doesn't taste like salt." Then she turned and led the mule away, disappearing into the haze without another word. Cora watched her go. She stood there in the pool she was digging, 3 feet below the surface of the dying world, and she thought about what the old woman had said. The old ways had worked when the new ways were still being invented. The pioneers had lived in the ground before they could afford to live above it. They had survived blizzards and droughts and dust storms by going down instead of up, by putting layers of earth between themselves and the fury of the sky. Maybe it was time to go back. Cora picked up her pickaxe and went back to work. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something thick and heavy and hard to breathe. The dust swirled around her, coating her skin, filling her nose and mouth, trying to bury her before she could bury herself. But she kept digging. She dug until her arms refused to lift the pickaxe anymore. She dug until her vision blurred and her legs buckled, and she had to crawl out of the hole and collapse in the shade of the broken wagon. She lay there gasping, staring up at the brown sky, and she felt the earth beneath her back solid and patient and waiting. Then she drank the water the old woman had left, and she rested and she went back to digging. By the end of the second week, the hole was 6 feet deep. Cora stood at the bottom looking up at the rectangle of brown sky above her. The walls of earth rose around her, darker and cooler than anything on the surface. Down here, 3 feet below the line where the dust had killed everything, the soil was different. It was dense and moist, the color of chocolate, and it smelled like something other than death. It smelled like memory. Cora pressed her palm against the wall of the hole and felt the coolness seeping into her skin. She thought about her grandmother, who had been buried in this same earth 50 years ago. She thought about all the things that had been planted in this soil over the generations, all the seeds and hopes and dreams that had taken root and grown and fed the people who loved this land. The earth remembered. Even when the surface was dying, even when the wind was tearing the topsoil away and carrying it to places it had never belonged, the deep earth remembered what it was supposed to be. It remembered water and roots in the slow, patient cycle of growth and decay. It remembered how to nurture life. Cora climbed out of the hole and sat on the edge, her legs dangling into the coolness below. She looked at the broken wagon, at the heavy oak bed that had once hauled her grandfather's wheat to market. She looked at the farmhouse in the distance, its windows dark with accumulated dust, its walls slowly surrendering to the wind. She knew what she had to do. The wagon was the key. She could not afford lumber for a roof, and even if she could, boards would let the dust through. But the wagon bed was solid oak planking 4 inches thick, designed to hold 1,000 pounds of grain. If she could get it into the pit, it would become her ceiling. The problem was the weight. The wagon bed alone weighed over 500 pounds. The frame and remaining wheels added another 300. Cora was strong for a woman her age, toughened by years of farm work, but she could not lift 800 pounds. She could not drag it. She could not do anything except stand beside it and calculate how to move an immovable object with nothing but rope in desperation. She thought about the problem for 3 days. She thought about it while she dug, while she ate, while she lay awake at night listening to the wind carry more dust across the dying land. She turned the problem over in her mind, examining it from every angle, searching for a solution that did not require strength she did not have. On the third day, she found it: geometry. The answer was not strength. The answer was angle and distance in the patient, reliable force of gravity. She would dig a ramp. The ramp took another week. Cora started at the edge of the pit and dug backward, carving a long, gentle slope that dropped 1 foot for every 5 feet of length, 30 feet of ramp to descend 6 feet. A slope gentle enough that a wagon could roll down it without tipping, without breaking, without doing anything except surrendering to the pull of the earth. While she dug, she thought about Virgil. She thought about the way he had smiled when he promised to fix the wagon. The way he had said, "next week," every week for 2 years, the words becoming a ritual, a comfortable lie that neither of them believed anymore. She thought about the bank book with his careful record of theft, the receipt for the cattle he had sold without telling her. She thought about Della Morrison's soft hands and easy smile, but mostly she thought about the work, the rhythm of the shovel, the weight of the earth, the slow accumulation of progress that turned an impossible task into something merely difficult. She thought about her grandmother who had cleared this land with nothing but an axe and determination. She thought about her grandfather who had built the wagon she was about to bury. They had not given up. Neither would she. When the ramp was finished, Cora prepared the wagon. She blocked the remaining wheels with rocks, heavy stones she had gathered from the dried creek bed a mile away. She tied a rope to the wagon frame, ran it down the ramp, and wrapped it around a fence post she had driven deep into the ground at the bottom of the pit. The rope would not pull the wagon. The rope would guide it, keep it straight, prevent it from tumbling sideways as it rolled down the slope. Gravity would do the rest. Cora stood beside the wagon, her hand on the wheel blocks. The sun was setting, painting the dust clouds orange and red, and the wind had died down to something almost gentle. In the distance, a coyote howled, the first animal sound she had heard in weeks. She thought about what would happen if this did not work. If the wagon tipped sideways and crashed. If the bed shattered on impact. If she was wrong about the angle, wrong about the physics, wrong about everything. Then she thought about what would happen if she did nothing. If she sat in her dust-filled house and waited for the earth to bury her. If she became another story that Hadley told, another cautionary tale about stubborn people who did not know when to give up. She kicked the blocks free. The wagon lurched. For a terrible moment, it seemed to hang in place, balanced on the edge of movement. Then gravity took hold and it began to roll. Slowly at first, the remaining wheels creaked and groaned, protesting the movement after 2 years of stillness. The rope went taut, vibrating with tension. The wagon picked up speed, rumbling down the ramp, dust flying from beneath the wheels. Faster now. The sound grew louder, a deep rumble that Cora felt in her chest. The wagon was a runaway thing, 800 pounds of wood and iron surrendering to the pull of the earth. It hit the bottom of the pit with a sound like the end of the world. The impact threw dust into the air, a brown cloud that rose and spread and slowly settled. Cora stood at the top of the ramp, her heart pounding, her hands shaking, afraid to look. Then she walked down into the pit. The wagon bed had cracked. A long split ran through one of the oak planks, and 2 of the iron brackets had bent under the impact. The frame was twisted, the wheels shattered the whole structure, a broken wreck of what it had once been. But it had held. The bed was intact. The heavy oak planks, 4 inches thick, had survived the fall. They lay at the bottom of the pit like the skeleton of a roof waiting to be covered with earth, waiting to become the ceiling of a home. Cora stood in the pit looking at the broken wagon that her husband had never fixed, the wagon that her grandfather had built, the wagon that had carried wheat when wheat still grew, that had hauled hope when hope still seemed reasonable. It was not a vehicle anymore. It was the skeleton of a house. And standing there in the cool darkness at the bottom of her hole, surrounded by earth, that remembered what it meant to be alive, Cora Branton began to laugh. It was not a happy sound. It was not the laugh of a woman who had found something funny. It was the laugh of a woman who had found something true, something real, something that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Virgil's broken promise had become her salvation. The wagon he never fixed would keep her alive. The thing he had abandoned, like he had abandoned her, like he had abandoned everything that required patience and commitment and love, that thing would become the foundation of her survival. Cora laughed until she cried, and then she cried until she was empty, and then she climbed out of the pit and started planting the walls. The dust kept coming. While Cora worked on her dugout, the wind continued its patient destruction of the surface world. Every morning she woke to find new drifts against the farmhouse walls, new accumulations on the windowsills, new layers of brown powder coating everything she owned. She stopped fighting it. The farmhouse was dying and she let it die. She stopped sweeping the floors and wiping the surfaces and stuffing rags into the cracks. She let the dust accumulate, let the windows drift shut, let the rooms fill with the slow tide of earth that was burying everything above ground. Instead, she focused on the whole. She built walls of stacked sod around the wagon bed, cutting blocks of earth from the prairie and fitting them together like bricks. The sod was heavy and awkward, and her back screamed with every block she lifted, but the walls rose steadily, inch by inch, foot by foot. She left a gap on the east side for a door. East because the wind came from the west. East because the rising sun would be the first thing she saw each morning. East because it was the opposite direction from California, from Virgil, from everything she was leaving behind. She sealed the cracks between the wagon planks with a mixture of mud and straw, packing it in until no light showed through. She tested it by lying on her back in the pit and looking up, searching for any gap, any pinhole where dust might enter. When she found one, she sealed it. When she found another, she sealed that too. The work was endless, but it was good. For the first time since Virgil left, Cora felt like she was doing something that mattered. Not just surviving, not just waiting, but building. Creating something new from the wreckage of everything that had been destroyed. She piled excavated earth on top of the wagon bed 2 feet thick, then covered that with more sod to hold it in place. The weight pressed down on the oak planks, testing them, and they held. They had been built to carry 1,000 pounds of wheat, and 2 feet of earth was nothing compared to that. The entrance was the hardest part. Cora dug a narrow trench from the surface down to the door, but she did not dig it straight. She made it turn twice, creating a zigzag path that would catch any dust blown in by the wind. She lined the walls of the trench with flat stones from the creek bed, creating a smooth surface that would not crumble or collapse. The turns were the key. The dust storms came from the west, driven by winds that could strip paint from a car. The turns in the entrance would slow, that wind would force it to change direction twice before reaching the door. Any dust it carried would settle in the turns, would pile up in the corners, would be stopped before it could reach the living space. It was simple. It was obvious. It was the kind of solution that her grandmother would have understood, that the pioneers who had built the first dugouts would have recognized immediately. Go down. Turn twice. Let the earth protect you. By the end of the third week, the dugout was finished. Cora stood at the entrance and looked at what she had built. From the surface, it was almost invisible, just a low mound of earth with a narrow trench leading into its side. It could have been a natural feature of the landscape, a small hill that had always been there, nothing worth noticing. But inside it was a home. 8 feet by 10 feet, the exact dimensions of the wagon bed that formed its ceiling. She had lined the walls with old newspapers, the pages yellow and brittle, covered with stories from a world that seemed impossibly distant now. She had covered the floor with the canvas that had once protected loads of wheat, creating a surface that was almost soft, almost comfortable. She had installed a small iron stove vented through a pipe that emerged from the mound at an angle designed to prevent backdrafts. She had built a cot from salvaged lumber, a chair from an old barrel, a shelf from the wagon's broken sideboards. It was not comfortable, but it was sealed. Cora closed the door and lit a lamp, and she stood in the center of her underground room and breathed. The air was still and clean and utterly silent. No dust crept through the walls. No wind rattled the windows. No sound penetrated the 2 feet of earth above her head. For the first time in 3 years, she breathed without tasting grit. For the first time since the drought began, she stood in a space that the dust could not reach. She was underground, buried alive by her own choice, and she was finally free. The letter arrived on the first day of April. Cora had walked to town that morning, a 3-mile journey through the dust and the wind, to check her mail and buy what few supplies she could afford. The general store was nearly empty now. The shelves bare the owner, a ghost of the cheerful man he had been before the drought. She bought flour and salt and a small bag of beans. She bought matches and lamp oil and a spool of thread to mend her clothes. She spent the last of the coins she had found in Virgil's desk drawer, and she knew that when they were gone, she would have nothing. But that was a problem for another day. The letter was waiting in her box at the post office, a single envelope, thin and light, addressed in handwriting she did not recognize. The return address was Bakersfield, California. Cora stood in the post office holding the envelope, feeling her heart beat faster. For a moment, she thought it might be from Virgil. A letter of apology, perhaps. A plea to join him in California. A desperate attempt to undo the damage he had done. Then she looked more closely at the handwriting, and she knew. It was from Della. She opened the letter standing right there, her back against the wall of the post office, her hands trembling slightly. The words were written in a careful feminine script, the letters round and neat, the kind of handwriting they taught in schools where girls learned to be ladies instead of farmers. Dear Mrs. Branton, I am writing to you because I believe you deserve to know the truth, even though the truth is shameful and the shame is mine to carry. Virgil left me 3 weeks ago. We had barely arrived in Bakersfield when he met another woman, a waitress at a diner where we stopped for coffee. Within a week, he had moved in with her. Within 2 weeks, he had taken what little money we had left and disappeared. I am alone now in a strange city with nothing but the clothes on my back and the knowledge of what I have done. I want you to know that I am sorry, not because I expect your forgiveness, but because you deserve to hear it. I was foolish and vain, and I believed him when he said he loved me. I believed him when he said he would take care of me. I believed everything he said because I wanted to believe, because believing was easier than thinking. But I know now what you must have known for years. Virgil does not love anyone. He is not capable of staying in one place, of keeping one promise, of being faithful to one woman. He left you not because of fee, but because of who he is. I was just the excuse. The next woman will be another excuse. And the woman after that, and the woman after that, until he runs out of women or runs out of road. I do not know what will happen to me now. I do not know if I will survive this. But I wanted you to know that I am sorry and that I understand now what I should have understood from the beginning. You are better off without him. We both are. Della Morrison. Cora read the letter twice. She stood there in the post office, surrounded by the dust that crept in through every crack, and she read the words that Della Morrison had written from a diner in Bakersfield, California. She felt many things. Satisfaction, perhaps, that Virgil's betrayal had turned on him so quickly. Pity, maybe, for the young woman who had believed his lies. Anger still at the theft and the abandonment and the casual cruelty of a man who had promised to love her until death. But mostly she felt free. Virgil had not left her for someone better. He had not found happiness in California. He had simply continued being who he always was, a man who could not state a man who could not commit, a man who moved from woman to woman and place to place because standing still was too hard and keeping promises was impossible. She had not failed. She had not been found wanting. She had simply been married to a man who was incapable of being married, and now that man was gone, and she was still here, and she was going to survive. Cora folded the letter carefully. She walked outside into the dust and the wind, and she stood in the street of the dying town and she looked west toward California. Then she struck a match. She held the flame to the corner of the letter and she watched it burn. The paper curled and blackened, the words disappearing one by one until there was nothing left but ash. The ash blew away on the wind, joining the dust, becoming part of the great brown cloud that covered everything. And Cora turned her back on the west, and she started walking home toward the hole in the ground that was waiting for her, toward the life she was building from the wreckage of everything that had been destroyed. She did not think about Virgil again. She had more important things to do. She had a sky to worry about. The sky had been wrong for 3 days when Cora noticed the change in the birds. She had climbed out of her dugout at dawn, as she did every morning, to check the entrance trench for accumulated dust and to draw water from the well before the wind picked up. The April air was cool, carrying the faint memory of what spring used to feel like, back when spring meant something other than a different shade of brown. The sparrows were gone. For months, a small flock had been living in the ruins of the barn, nesting in the collapsed rafters, surviving on whatever seeds they could find in the dead fields. Cora had grown used to their sound, the cheerful chatter that reminded her she was not entirely alone on this dying land. She had even left crumbs for them, sometimes scraps of her meager meals, scattered near the barn door. But this morning the barn was silent. Cora stood in the yard listening to the wind, and she felt something cold settle in her chest. Animals knew things that people had forgotten how to know. They sensed changes in the air, shifts in pressure, the subtle warnings that preceded disaster. If the birds had fled, something was coming. She looked west toward the horizon that had swallowed her husband's car 3 months ago. The sky there was the color of a bruised yellow and purple and brown, the colors mixing and swirling in ways that seemed wrong, seemed unnatural, seemed like the sky itself was sick. Cora had lived through dust storms before. Everyone in Oklahoma had lived through dust storms. They came with the wind turning day into twilight, filling lungs and eyes and mouths with the powdered remains of 1,000 ruined farms. They lasted hours or days, and then they passed, and life continued in the strange new normal of the Dust Bowl. But this felt different. This felt like something that would not pass. She spent the morning preparing. She filled every container she owned with water from the well, knowing the dust would foul it for days after the storm hit. She wet 3 rags and sealed them in a mason jar, preserving their moisture for when she would need to breathe through them. She carried her supplies down the entrance trench, through the 2 turns, and into the dugout. Then she climbed back up and stood on top of her buried home, watching the western sky. The color was spreading. Mr. Hadley returned that afternoon. Cora heard his footsteps before she saw him, the crunch of shoes on the hard-packed earth, a sound that seemed too loud in the unnatural stillness. She was sitting on the mound of her dugout, her eyes fixed on the horizon, when he appeared from the direction of town. He was not driving. His car sat somewhere behind him. She assumed perhaps broken down, perhaps stuck in a drift, perhaps simply abandoned. He walked with the slow, careful steps of a man who was not used to walking, his polished shoes already coated with dust, his suit jacket thrown over his arm. He stopped at the edge of her property and looked at the strange mound of earth with the trench leading into its side. He looked at the collapsed barn at the farmhouse with its windows drifted shut, at the dead fields stretching away in every direction. Then he looked at Cora. "Mrs. Branton," he said. His voice was hoarse, roughened by the dust in the air. "I see you're still here. I told you I would be." Hadley walked closer, his eyes moving across the mound, the trench, the carefully placed stones that lined the entrance. Understanding dawned slowly on his face, followed by something that might have been disbelief. "You actually did it," he said. "You buried yourself in the ground." "I buried the wagon. I'm living in it." That's... He paused, searching for words the same way he had searched weeks ago. "That's not a house, Mrs. Branton. That's a hole in the ground with some wood over it. The county won't recognize this as a habitable structure. You can't claim homestead exemption on a grave." Cora stood up slowly, brushing the dust from her dress. Her clothes were cleaner than they had been in months, she realized. Living underground meant living away from the constant accumulation of dirt that plagued everyone else. Her skin was cleaner too, her hair, her hands. She was becoming a creature of the earth, and the earth was taking care of her. "The county can come see it any time they like," she said. "They'll find a door, a roof, and a woman who isn't choking on dust every morning." That's more than most folks can say right now. Hadley looked at the mound again, then at the farmhouse 50 yards away. The house was barely visible now, its outline softened by the drifts that had accumulated against its walls. In another month, it would be buried entirely, another monument to the stubbornness of people who had tried to live above the ground. "The bank has decided to write off the county," Hadley said. His voice had lost its professional smoothness, replaced by something that sounded almost like exhaustion. "All of it, every farm, every mortgage, every debt. Nobody wants to foreclose on a desert. Nobody wants to own land that's worth less than the paper the deed is printed on." Cora felt something shift in her chest. "So you're not here to take my land. I'm here to tell you that your land isn't worth taking." Hadley laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Congratulations, Mrs. Branton. You've won. You get to keep 400 acres of dust in a hole in the ground. I hope it makes you happy." He turned to leave, then stopped. He looked at the sky, at the bruised colors spreading from the west, at the stillness that had settled over everything like a held breath. "Something's coming," he said. "Something bad. I've been in Oklahoma my whole life, and I've never seen a sky like that. If I were you, I'd get underground and stay there." Then he walked away, his footsteps fading into the silence, his figure disappearing into the haze. Cora watched him go. She thought about what he had said, about winning, about keeping land that wasn't worth taking. She thought about the 3 months she had spent digging and building and transforming a broken wagon into the skeleton of a home. She had not done it to win. She had done it to survive. And looking at that sky, at the colors that seemed to pulse and shift like something alive, she knew that survival was about to be tested in ways she could not imagine. The rabbits disappeared the next morning. Cora had seen them occasionally, the small brown shapes darting between the dead stalks of what had once been wheat. They had survived the drought the same way she had, by finding water where there seemed to be none, by eating things that seemed inedible, by refusing to give up even when giving up seemed like the only sensible option. But now they were gone. She walked the perimeter of her property looking for any sign of life and found nothing. No rabbits, no birds, no insects buzzing in the dry grass. Even the flies had vanished, those persistent scavengers that had seemed immune to the dust. The land was empty. It was as if the earth itself had taken a breath and was holding it, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the sky to do whatever the sky was preparing to do. Cora returned to her dugout and began her final preparations. She had been storing supplies for weeks, ever since she finished construction. Dried beans and flour and salt. Canned vegetables she had bought before the money ran out. Water in every container she could find, sealed and stored in the cool darkness of the underground room. She had enough to last a month if she was careful, longer if she was desperate. She checked the door, running her hands along the edges, feeling for gaps. She had sealed it well, she knew, had packed mud and straw into every crack, had hung a wet blanket on the inside to catch any dust that might creep through. She checked the stovepipe, making sure it was clear, making sure the angle was correct. The pipe emerged from the mound at a slant designed to prevent downdrafts, and she had capped the top with a tin can that would keep out the worst of the dust while still allowing smoke to escape. She checked everything twice. Then she climbed back up to the surface and stood on her mound and watched the sky. The colors were darker now, more intense. The yellow had deepened to amber, the purple to a deep bruised violet. And at the edges, spreading slowly but steadily from the west, there was black. Not the black of night, the black of earth. The black of 1,000,000 tons of soil lifted into the air and carried by winds that could strip flesh from bone. Cora had heard stories about the black blizzards. Everyone had. They said the dust blocked out the sun entirely, turning noon into midnight. They said you could suffocate in minutes if you were caught outside your lungs, filling with dirt faster than you could cough it out. They said the static electricity in the clouds could knock a man unconscious, could stop a heart, could set a barn on fire without a single spark of flame. She had heard the stories, but she had never seen one. Now watching that black wall approach from the west, she understood that the stories had not been exaggerations. If anything, they had been understatements. The old woman with the mule appeared on the morning of April 14th. Cora was drawing water from the well when she saw the figure emerging from the eastern haze, moving slowly, leading an animal that seemed barely able to walk. She set down her bucket and waited, watching the old woman approach. It was Esther. The same woman who had appeared during the digging, who had told her about the grandmother in Kansas who had left water and wisdom and then disappeared without asking for anything in return. "You need to get underground," Esther said. Her voice was different now, urgent in a way it had not been before. "Today, now, don't wait for the sky to turn black." "I know," Cora said. "I've been preparing." Esther looked at the mound at the entrance trench, at the careful construction that Cora had spent weeks creating. Something like approval crossed her weathered face. "My grandmother said the worst storms always came in April," she said. "Something about the way the air moves, the way the cold from the north meets the heat from the south. She said April was when the earth got angry." "How long do you think it will last?" "Hours, days. There's no way to know." Esther looked at the sky, at the black wall that was visibly closer, now eating the horizon mile by mile. "But when it's over, nothing will be the same. The ones who survive all have to start over from nothing." She reached into the sack on her mule saddle and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She handed it to Cora. "Seeds," she said. "Corn and beans and squash. The kind my grandmother brought from the old country, the kind that remembers how to grow in hard times. When the rain comes back, and it will come back someday, you plant these." Cora took the bundle. It weighed almost nothing, but it felt heavier than anything she had ever held. "Why are you giving these to me?" Esther smiled, the expression strange on her weathered face. "Because you're the one who dug down. Because you're the one who listened to the earth instead of fighting it. Because when this is over, someone needs to remember how to make things grow." She turned and started walking, leading her tired mule toward the east. "Where will you go?" Cora called after her. "Same place I always go," Esther said without looking back. "Underground. I've got my own hole, Mrs. Branton. Been living in it for 2 years now. The dust doesn't know I exist." Then she was gone, swallowed by the haze, and Cora was alone with the seeds and the sky and the black wall that was coming to bury everything. The stillness began at noon. Cora was inside her dugout making final adjustments when she noticed that the sound of the wind had stopped. She climbed up the entrance trench and emerged onto the surface, and she stood there in the silence and felt her skin prickle with electricity. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on her like a physical weight. The haze had taken on a yellowish tint, and the light was wrong, the shadows falling at angles that made no sense, as if the sun had moved to a place it had never been before. And the black wall was close now, 20 miles, maybe less. She could see it clearly, a solid mass of darkness stretching from the ground to the top of the sky. It was not a cloud. It was the earth itself lifted into the air and moving at a speed that seemed impossible for something so massive. The front edge was perfectly defined, a razor line between the yellow-brown daylight and absolute darkness. On this side of the line, there was still a world. On the other side, there was nothing. Cora stood on her mound and watched the darkness approach. She thought about her grandmother buried on the hill behind the barn. She thought about her grandfather who had built the wagon that now formed the ceiling of her home. She thought about all the Brantons who had worked this land, who had loved it, who had given their lives to it. She thought about Virgil somewhere in California, probably with another woman by now, probably running from another set of promises he couldn't keep. She thought about the seeds in her pocket, the corn and beans and squash that remembered how to grow in hard times. And she thought about the dugout beneath her feet, the hole she had dug with her own hands, the impossible home she had built from a broken wagon in desperate hope. Then she went underground and closed the door behind her. The storm hit at 4:07 in the afternoon. Cora knew the time because she had wound her grandmother's clock that morning, the old brass timepiece that had survived the journey from Missouri 50 years ago. The clock sat on the shelf she had built from wagon boards, its ticking the only sound in the underground silence. She was sitting on her cot, her back against the earthen wall when the darkness came. It did not arrive gradually. There was no slow dimming, no gentle transition from day to twilight to night. One moment there was pale light filtering down the entrance trench, and the next moment there was nothing. Absolute darkness. Darker than any night Cora had ever experienced. Darker than the root cellar where her mother had stored preserves, darker than the closet where she had hidden as a child during thunderstorms. This was a darkness that seemed to have weight, that seemed to press against her eyes like a physical force. She lit her lamp with trembling hands, and the small flame pushed back the darkness, but did not defeat it. The shadows in the corners of the dugout seemed deeper than they should be, as if the darkness outside was seeping through the walls, trying to find her, trying to fill her lungs and stop her heart. Then the sound came. It started as a low rumble like distant thunder, but it did not fade. It grew louder and louder, building in intensity until it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls and the ceiling and the earth itself. It was not the sound of wind. It was the sound of the world being torn apart, the sound of 1,000,000 tons of soil grinding against itself as it moved across the land at 60 miles an hour. The dugout shook. Cora felt the vibration in her bones and her teeth and the very core of her being. The lamp flickered and nearly went out, and for a terrible moment, she thought the ceiling would collapse, thought the wagon bed would crack and the earth would pour in and bury her alive. But the ceiling held. The oak planks groaned under the weight of the accumulating dust, but they did not break. They had been built to carry 1,000 pounds of wheat, and they carried the weight of the storm the same way with patient, solid strength. Cora sat in the shaking darkness and listened to the world end. She thought about Hadley alone in his house in town. She thought about the families who had stayed, who had stuffed rags in their windows and wet blankets over their doors and prayed that the dust would pass. She thought about the children who would breathe the black air and choke on it, whose lungs would fill with dirt while their parents watched helplessly. She thought about all the people who were dying on the surface while she sat safe in her hole. And she breathed. Clean air, still air, air that tasted of earth and wood and nothing else. The 2 feet of soil above the wagon bed absorbed the worst of the sound, turning the apocalyptic roar into something almost manageable. The baffled entrance caught the dust and dropped it in the turns, preventing it from reaching her door. The wet rags she had stuffed into the cracks stayed wet because there was no wind to dry them. She had built this place for exactly this moment, and it was working. The storm raged on. Hours passed. Cora had no way to measure them except by the slow burning of her lamp and the ticking of her grandmother's clock. She sat on her cot and listened to the sound of the world being erased, and she waited for it to end. Sometimes the noise grew louder, so loud that she pressed her hands over her ears and screamed just to hear something other than the grinding roar of the dust. Sometimes it faded to a dull rumble, almost peaceful, and she would think it was over, only to have it surge again, stronger than before. She did not sleep. She could not imagine sleeping through this, even though her body ached with exhaustion and her eyes burned from the dim light of the lamp. She sat and listened, and waited, and she thought about all the things she had done to reach this moment. She thought about the bank book burning in the stove. She thought about the letter from Della, the words turning to ash in the street. She thought about Hadley's face when he realized she was not going to give up, when he understood that she would rather bury herself than walk away. She thought about the 2 weeks of digging the pickaxe ringing against stone, the blisters and the blood and the muscles that screamed for rest. She thought about the ramp and the rope and the moment when the wagon had rolled into the pit with a sound like the end of everything. She thought about all the impossible things she had done, and she realized they had not been impossible at all. They had simply been necessary. They had been what survival required, and she had done them because the alternative was unacceptable. The storm would end. Everything ended eventually. And when it was over, she would climb out of her hole and see what was left of the world. Until then, she would wait. Until then, she would breathe. The silence came at 7:23 in the evening. Cora was lying on her cot, not sleeping, but not fully awake, either floating in the strange twilight state that exhaustion brings. The roar had become a constant presence, so unvarying that her mind had begun to filter it out, to treat it as background noise rather than the sound of destruction. Then it stopped. The transition was as sudden as the onset had been. One moment the world was screaming, and the next moment there was nothing. Just the ticking of the clock, the hiss of the lamp, and the soft sound of her own breathing. Cora sat up. She listened for a long moment, waiting for the sound to return, waiting for the roar to surge back and prove that the silence was just a trick, just a brief pause in the endless assault. But the silence held. She stood up slowly, her muscles stiff from hours of sitting. She walked to the door and pressed her ear against it, listening for any sound from the outside world. She heard nothing. Not wind, not settling dust, not the creak of damaged structures or the cries of animals or any of the other sounds that should have followed a storm of that magnitude. Just silence. She reached for the door handle, then stopped. Her hand was shaking, she realized, not from fear but from something else. From the knowledge that whatever she found on the other side of that door would change everything. From the understanding that the world she had known, the world of farmhouses and fences and familiar landmarks, might no longer exist. She took a deep breath. She opened the door. The entrance trench was filled with dust. Not just a layer of dust, not just an accumulation. The trench was completely full-packed solid with fine black powder that had drifted in during the storm. The turn she had built to catch the dust had worked exactly as intended, catching it and holding it and preventing it from reaching her door. But now that dust blocked her exit. Cora stood in the doorway looking at the wall of black earth that separated her from the surface, and she laughed. It was a strange sound in the silence, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere outside herself, the laugh of a woman who had survived the unsurvivable only to find herself buried alive. Then she picked up her shovel and started digging. The dust was soft, almost fluid, easier to move than the hard-packed earth she had excavated to build this place. She shoveled it behind her into the dugout, creating a pile of fine black powder on the floor of her home. With each shovelful, the wall grew smaller, the surface grew closer. It took her an hour to dig through 18 inches of accumulated dust. When she finally broke through to the surface, when her shovel pierced the last layer and fresh air rushed in, Cora stopped and stood and stared at what was left of the world. The landscape was unrecognizable. The farmhouse was buried to its windows, the walls barely visible above smooth drifts of black dust. The barn had collapsed entirely, its roof caved in under the weight of the accumulated dirt, its walls leaning at impossible angles. The fence posts that had marked the boundaries of her property were gone, invisible beneath the sea of powder that covered everything. The horizon had changed. Hills that had not existed that morning rose and fell in gentle waves, dunes of dust that had been deposited by the wind in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The familiar landmarks were gone, the dead trees and rock outcroppings and dirt roads that had oriented her to this place for 9 years. Everything had been erased, wiped clean, replaced by a smooth black emptiness that stretched in every direction. Cora climbed out of the trench and stood on top of her mound. She turned in a slow circle, looking for anything she recognized, anything that connected this alien landscape to the world she had known. To the east, she could see the faint outline of the church steeple in town 3 miles away, but it seemed shorter than it should be, as if the building had sunk into the earth. To the west, there was nothing, just the endless black dunes and the sky that was slowly clearing, the brown haze giving way to patches of blue that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness of the storm. To the south, a shape that might have been the Henderson farm, or might have been a natural formation, or might have been her imagination trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. To the north, the hill where her grandmother was buried. Cora looked at that hill for a long time. It was still there. Change certainly covered with a layer of black dust, like everything else, but still recognizable. Still the place where Martha Branton had been laid to rest 50 years ago, where Ezekiel had joined her 20 years later, where the 3 small graves with no names marked the children who had not survived. The hill had endured, and so had she. Cora stood on her mound, the only human-made structure still visible in the landscape, and she felt something break open in her chest. Not grief, not relief, not any emotion she could name. Something larger than emotion, something that encompassed all the fear and hope and desperate determination that had brought her to this moment. She had survived. The worst storm in the history of this land, the black blizzard that had turned day into night and buried everything above the ground, had passed over her head while she sat in her underground room and breathed clean air. She had survived because she had listened to the earth instead of fighting it, because she had gone down instead of trying to stand up, because she had taken a broken wagon and a desperate idea and turned them into something that could endure what nothing else could endure. Cora stood in the silence of the devastated world, and she began to understand what she had done. She had not just saved herself, she had proven something. She had demonstrated that there was a way to live in this dying land, a way to survive the dust that was burying everything else. She had found an answer that nobody else had thought to look for, or maybe an answer that everybody had forgotten. Go down. Let the earth protect you. Trust the ground that your ancestors are buried in. The sun was setting now, painting the dust clouds orange and red, and the light was beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel. How could something so destructive leave behind something so lovely? How could the same sky that had tried to kill her now offer her this gift of color and light? Cora did not have answers to those questions. She was too tired for philosophy, too exhausted for meaning. She was a woman who had survived, standing on a mound of earth that contained everything she owned, looking out at a world that would never be the same. Tomorrow she would begin the work of living in that world. Tonight she would rest. She climbed back down into her dugout, closing the door behind her, sealing out the silence and the dust in the strange new landscape. She laid down on her cot and closed her eyes, and within minutes she was asleep. The deepest sleep she had known in months. The sleep of someone who had finally stopped fighting and learned to surrender to the earth. The survivors began appearing 3 days later. Cora was on the surface clearing dust from the entrance trench when she saw the first one. A figure moving across the black dunes from the direction of town, walking slowly, stumbling sometimes, but moving with a determined gait of someone who had somewhere to be. She waited, leaning on her shovel, watching the figure approach. It was a woman. Young, maybe 25, with a baby wrapped in a dust-caked blanket. Her face was covered with a rag, but her eyes were visible above it, red, and streaming, the whites turned pink from irritation. "Please," the woman said when she was close enough to speak. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Please, my baby can't breathe. I heard there was a place underground, a place where the air is clean." Cora looked at the baby. It was making small sounds, weak cries that seemed to take all its strength. Its eyes were closed, its tiny face crusted with dried mucus and dust. "Come," Cora said. She led the woman down the entrance trench, through the turns into the dugout. The woman stopped just inside the door, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, and she took a deep breath. Then she began to cry. The air, she said, her voice breaking, the air is clean. I forgot what clean air felt like. Cora took the baby from her arms and laid it on the cot. She wet a rag with clean water and began to gently wipe the dust from its face from around its eyes and nose and mouth. The baby's cries grew stronger as it took its first deep breaths of air that didn't taste like dirt. What's your name? Cora asked. Sarah, Sarah Hendricks. My husband is... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. He was in the barn when it collapsed. I couldn't find him. I looked for 2 days, but there's so much dust. Everything is buried. I couldn't find him. Cora nodded. She didn't offer platitudes or false hope. She just kept cleaning. The baby kept doing the one useful thing she could do in that moment. You can stay here, she said, as long as you need to. More came after that. An old man who had hidden in his root cellar, but whose cellar had flooded with dust when the door collapsed. A family of 5 who had survived in their car, sealing the windows with rags, but whose youngest child had developed a cough that wouldn't stop. A teenage boy who had been working in town when the storm hit and had walked the 3 miles home to find his family's farm erased from the landscape. They came one at a time or in small groups, led by rumors and desperation in the hope that somewhere someone had found a way to survive. They came coughing and blind, their lungs full of what used to be Kansas, in Nebraska, in Oklahoma, and 100 other places the wind had collected. They came looking for water, for food, for any sign that the world hadn't ended entirely. They found Cora. She didn't turn anyone away. She couldn't. These were her neighbors, her community, the people who had waved to her from their cars and sold her flour at the general store and sat beside her in church on Sundays. They were suffering, and she had something that could ease their suffering, and that was enough. The dugout was small, only 8 feet by 10, barely enough room for one person to live comfortably. But comfort was not the point anymore. Survival was the point. And survival meant making room, meant squeezing together, meant sharing the clean air and the cool darkness with anyone who needed it. Cora gave up her cot to the mothers and children. She slept on the floor wrapped in a blanket, her back against the earthen wall. She rationed her water and her food, stretching supplies that had been meant for one person across a dozen, then 2 dozen, then more. And she began to plan. The expansion started in the 2nd week. Cora had been thinking about it since the first survivors arrived, calculating dimensions and angles and structural requirements. The dugout had worked, had proven itself against the worst storm in living memory. But it was too small for what it had become, too cramped to serve as a refuge for everyone who needed refuge. She needed to build another room. The work was familiar now, the rhythm of the pickaxe and the shovel as natural as breathing. But this time she was not working alone. The survivors who were strong enough to help took turns digging, while those who weren't looked after the children and prepared what little food there was. They excavated a space beside the original dugout, 10 feet by 10 feet, connected by a short tunnel that Cora lined with boards salvaged from her collapsed barn. The ceiling was a problem, there being no wagon bed to form the roof, but she solved it with layers of lumber and sod packed tight and covered with 2 feet of earth. It wasn't as strong as the original. It wouldn't survive another Black Sunday, but it would keep out the ordinary dust, the daily accumulation that was still burying everything on the surface. It would provide clean air and shelter for the people who had nowhere else to go. The children called it the rabbit hole. Cora heard them using the term one afternoon, whispering to each other as they played in the cramped space, and she felt something like pride. Rabbits went underground to survive. Rabbits burrowed into the earth when danger threatened, and they emerged again when the danger passed. That was what they were doing. That was what she had taught them to do. Go down, wait for the danger to pass, come back up when it's safe. Mr. Hadley returned in the first week of May. He did not look like the same man who had visited her farm 3 months ago. His suit was gone, replaced by work clothes that were stained and torn. His polished shoes were destroyed, the leather cracked and coated with black dust. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his skin the color of old parchment. He stood at the entrance to the trench and looked down at the door that led into the earth. "Mrs. Branton," he said, His voice was barely recognizable. "I came to see if you were still alive." Cora climbed up from the dugout and stood facing him. She was thinner than she had been, worn down by the work and the rationing and the constant demands of the people who depended on her. But her eyes were clear and her voice was strong. "I'm still here," she said. Hadley nodded slowly. He looked around at the changed landscape, at the black dunes that covered everything at the mound of earth that contained the only habitable space for miles. "The town is gone," he said. "The bank, the general store, the church, all of it buried or collapsed. I spent 3 days digging out my office, and there was nothing left to dig out for. The records are ruined. The vault is full of dust. Everything I spent my life building is worthless now." Cora said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I've been sleeping in my car," Hadley continued. "It's the only thing I have left that the dust can't get into. I seal the windows with rags, and I sleep sitting up, and I wake up every morning covered in powder anyway." He paused, looking at the trench at the door at the underground world that Cora had built. "I came to ask if there's room down there," he said. "For me, just for a night or two, just until I figure out what to do next." Cora looked at him for a long moment. This was the man who had tried to take her land for nothing. The man who had laughed at her, who had called her stubborn and foolish, who had predicted that she would choke on her own ceiling. The man who had represented everything that had failed the banks and the institutions and the systems that had promised prosperity and delivered dust. He was also a man who was suffering. A man who was alone and afraid and desperate, just like everyone else. "There's room," Cora said. "Come down." She turned and led him into the trench, through the turns into the dugout. He stopped just inside the door, the same way Sarah Hendricks had stopped, the same way everyone stopped when they first entered this place. "The air," he said softly. "My God, the air." "Sit down," Cora said. "Rest. There's water if you need it." Hadley lowered himself to the floor, his back against the wall. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, and Cora watched all of the tension drain out of his shoulders. Watched the fear that had been carved into his face begin to soften. "How did you know?" he asked after a while. "How did you know this would work when nothing else did?" Cora considered the question. She thought about the broken wagon, the empty bank account, the husband who had left her with nothing but dust and debt. She thought about the 2 weeks of digging the geometry of the ramp, the crash of the wagon hitting the bottom of the pit. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I just knew I couldn't keep living above the ground. The surface wasn't working anymore. So I went down." Hadley opened his eyes and looked at her. Really looked at her for what might have been the first time. "You were right," he said. "And I was wrong. About everything." Cora nodded. She didn't need his admission, didn't need his apology or his acknowledgement. But she accepted it anyway because acceptance was easier than resentment, and she was too tired for resentment. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow we start building the third room." The rain came in August of 1936. It started as a few drops so light that Cora thought she was imagining it. She was on the surface checking the ventilation pipes of the expanded dugout when she felt the first one land on her cheek. She stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid that moving would make it stop. Then another drop, and another. Within minutes it was pouring, real rain. Heavy rain that soaked into the dust and turned it to mud and filled the air with a smell that Cora had almost forgotten existed. The smell of water, the smell of life, the smell of a world that remembered what it was supposed to be. The survivors emerged from the dugout and stood in the rain like people witnessing a miracle. Children opened their mouths to catch the drops. Women wept openly, their tears mixing with the water that fell from the sky. Men stood silent and stunned, their faces lifted to the clouds. Cora stood among them, feeling the rain soak through her clothes, watching the black dust turn to black mud. She thought about the seeds that Esther had given her, the corn and beans and squash that remembered how to grow in hard times. She thought about the land that her family had worked for 4 generations, the land that had almost killed her, the land that had also saved her. She thought about planting. It would take years for the land to recover. Years of rain and patience and careful work, years of rebuilding what the dust had destroyed. But it would recover. The earth remembered what it was supposed to be, just like Esther's grandmother had said. The earth remembered, and given time and water, it would remember how to grow things again. Cora stood in the rain and made a decision. She would stay. She would plant the seeds and tend the land and wait for the earth to heal itself. She would teach the others what she had learned: how to go down when the storms came, how to trust the ground instead of fighting it. And someday, when the rain had washed away the last of the black dust and the fields were green again, she would stand on this land and know that she had not just survived. She had endured. She had become part of the earth itself, as rooted and permanent as the grandmother who was buried on the hill, as lasting as the wagon bed that had kept her alive through the worst storm in American history. The Dust Bowl was not over. There would be more storms, more suffering, more years of struggle before the land recovered. But Cora Branton was not going anywhere. She had found her place. She had found her home, and no amount of dust would ever bury her again. The sky had been wrong for a week before anyone admitted it out loud. Cora noticed it first on the morning of April 7th when she climbed out of her dugout to draw water from the well. The air had a weight to it that she had never felt before, a pressure that seemed to push down on her shoulders and settle into her lungs like something solid. The horizon to the west was not brown or tan or any of the usual colors of the dust-laden sky. It was yellow, a deep sulfurous yellow that reminded her of bruises in their final stage of healing, that sickly color between purple and green that meant something was deeply wrong beneath the surface. She stood by the well and watched the yellow spread across the morning sky, and she felt the hair on her arms rise as if lightning were about to strike. The birds had been gone for 3 days by then. The sparrows that had nested in the ruins of the barn, the crows that had circled the dead fields looking for anything edible, even the vultures that had become a common sight as the livestock died off across the county. All of them had vanished, fled to wherever birds go when they sense something that human beings are too proud or too foolish to feel. The rabbits had disappeared the day before, abandoning their burrows in the hardpan, leaving behind nothing but empty holes and the faint smell of fear. Even the insects were silent. No flies buzzed around the well. No beetles crawled across the cracked earth. The land had gone quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before a scream. Cora drew her water and carried it down into the dugout, and she began to prepare for something she could not name, but could feel in her bones. She filled every container she owned: mason jars, coffee cans, the old milk pail that had sat unused since the last cow died. She filled them all from the well, working the pump handle until her arms ached, knowing that whatever was coming would foul the water for days or weeks afterward. She sealed the containers with wax and cloth and set them in the coolest corner of the dugout, where the earth stayed cold even in the heat of summer. She wet 3 rags and placed them in a mason jar, screwing the lid tight to preserve their moisture. She would need them to breathe through when the dust came, and she knew that once the storm hit, there would be no way to wet them again. She checked her food supplies: dried beans flour, a small amount of salt, canned vegetables that she had been hoarding since before Virgil left their labels faded, but their seals still intact. Enough to last 3 weeks if she was careful, longer if she was desperate. She checked the door, running her fingers along every edge, feeling for gaps where the dust might creep through. She had sealed it well during construction, packing mud and straw into every crack, but she added more now, building up the barriers between herself and whatever was coming. She checked the entrance trench, making sure the turns were clear, making sure the stones that lined the walls were secure. The turns were the key to her survival. They would catch the dust and drop it before it could reach her. Door would slow the wind and still its power before it could tear her home apart. When she had done everything she could do, she climbed back to the surface and stood on top of her mound and watched the sky burn. The yellow had deepened to amber, and at the edges of the horizon where the sky met the dead earth, There was a darkness that seemed to pulse and shift like something alive. Not clouds, something else. Something that moved against the wind instead of with it, that grew and spread with a purpose that felt almost intentional. Cora had lived through dust storms before. Everyone in Oklahoma had lived through dust storms. They were part of life now, as common as sunrise, as inevitable as death. You sealed your windows and covered your face and waited for them to pass, and then you swept up the dirt that had crept in anyway and went on with your life. But this was different. This was something that had not happened before, something that the old-timers had never seen, something that existed outside the boundaries of normal experience. The pressure in the air, the color of the sky, the silence of the animals. Everything pointed to a catastrophe that exceeded anything the land had known. Cora watched the darkness gather on the horizon, and she made her peace with whatever was about to happen. If she survived, she would rebuild. If she didn't survive, she would be buried in the land she loved alongside her grandmother and grandfather and the three small graves with no names. Either way, she would not run. Either way, she would not abandon this place. She went underground and closed the door behind her. The darkness came on April 14th at 7 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. Cora was sitting on her cot, her back against the earthen wall, listening to the silence that had fallen over the world. The wind had died completely in the last hour, leaving behind a stillness so profound that she could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the blood moving through her veins, could hear the soft tick of her grandmother's clock, counting off the seconds until the end of everything. She was not afraid. Fear required energy, and she had spent all her energy on preparation. What remained was something calmer, something closer to acceptance. She had done everything she could do. The rest was up to the earth. The sound reached her first. It started as a low rumble, so faint that she thought she might be imagining it. A vibration more than a sound, something she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. It grew slowly, building in intensity until it became a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then the light disappeared. Cora had left the door cracked slightly, just enough to let in a sliver of daylight, just enough to see without burning her precious lamp oil. That sliver of light vanished in an instant, as if someone had blown out the sun. One moment there was day, and the next moment there was night, and the transition happened so fast that her eyes couldn't adjust, couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. She struck a match and lit her lamp, and the small flame pushed back the darkness enough to show her the familiar walls of her dugout, the shelf with its supplies, the door with its rags stuffed into every crack. The door was holding. Outside, the world was ending. She could hear it now, the full fury of the storm unleashed a sound that went beyond wind, beyond noise, beyond anything she had words to describe. It was the sound of the earth itself being torn apart and scattered across the sky, the sound of 1,000,000 tons of soil grinding against itself as it moved at speeds that should have been impossible. The dugout shook, the walls trembled, and the ceiling groaned, and the oak planks of the wagon bed creaked under a weight that grew heavier with each passing minute. Dust accumulated on top of the mound, pressing down, testing the strength of the structure she had built. Cora sat on her cot and watched the lamp flame flicker, and she waited to see if her home would hold or collapse. Minutes passed, hours. The storm raged on, tireless and relentless, and the dugout continued to shake, and the ceiling continued to groan, and still it held. The wagon bed that Virgil had never fixed, the oak planks that her grandfather had cut and shaped 50 years ago. They held the weight of the apocalypse and did not break. The entrance trench was doing its job. She could tell because the air inside the dugout remained clean, remained breathable, remained free of the choking dust that was burying everything on the surface. The turns caught the wind and stole its power, caught the dust and dropped it in neat piles that would need to be cleared when the storm was over. If the storm was ever over. Cora lost track of time. The clock on her shelf kept ticking, counting off seconds and minutes and hours, but the numbers stopped meaning anything. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. She might have been in the dugout for 3 hours, or 3 days, or 3 years. She couldn't tell. She could only wait and breathe and trust the earth to protect her. She thought about her grandmother, who had crossed the country in a covered wagon to reach this land. She thought about her grandfather, who had built the wagon that now formed her ceiling. She thought about all the Brantons who had worked this ground, who had sweated and bled and died on these 400 acres. They had survived worse than this. They had survived blizzards and droughts and fever and war. They had survived because they refused to give up, because they understood that survival was not about strength, but about stubbornness, about the simple refusal to lie down and die. Cora was a Branton. She would not give up either. The silence came at 23 minutes past 7 in the evening. Cora was lying on her cot, not sleeping, but not fully awake, floating in the gray space between consciousness and oblivion. The roar of the storm had become a constant presence, so unvarying that her mind had learned to ignore it, to treat it as background noise rather than the sound of destruction. Then it stopped. The silence was so sudden and so complete that it felt like a physical blow, like someone had struck her in the chest and knocked all the air from her lungs. She sat up, her heart pounding her ears, straining to hear something, anything in the void that the storm had left behind. Nothing. No wind, no settling dust, no creaking structures or distant cries, or any of the sounds that should have followed 3 hours of apocalyptic fury. Just silence, deep and absolute and terrifying. Cora stood up slowly, her muscles stiff from hours of tension. She walked to the door and pressed her ear against it, listening for any hint of what waited on the other side. She heard nothing. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the clean air of the dugout, savoring it because she did not know if she would ever breathe clean air again. Then she reached for the door handle. The door would not open. She pushed against it gently at first, then harder. The door moved slightly, maybe an inch, then stopped. Something was blocking it from the other side. Something heavy, something solid, something that had accumulated during the storm. Dust. The entrance trench had filled with dust, just as she had designed it to do. The turns had caught the debris and held it, preventing it from reaching her door, and now that debris stood between her and the surface like a wall of earth. Cora picked up her shovel. She had to dig at an awkward angle, pushing the blade through the narrow gap where the door had opened, scraping away dust a few inches at a time. The work was slow and exhausting, and the dust she removed had to be piled behind her in the dugout, covering the floor in a layer of fine black powder. She dug for an hour. She dug until her arms burned and her back screamed and her lungs ached from breathing air that grew thicker with dust as she worked. She dug through 18 inches of accumulated debris, through the powder that had been Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma, and places she would never know, through the remains of farms and families and dreams that had been scattered across the continent by winds that answered to no one. When she finally broke through, when her shovel pierced the last layer and fresh air rushed in, she stopped and stood and stared. The world had ended. That was the only way to describe what she saw when she climbed out of the entrance trench and stood on the surface of her mound. The world she had known, the world of farmhouses and fences and familiar landmarks, that world was gone. In its place was something alien, something that bore no resemblance to the Oklahoma she had lived in for 30 years. The farmhouse was buried to its windows. The walls were barely visible above smooth drifts of black dust, and the roof was bowed inward, sagging under a weight it had never been designed to carry. The windows were dark, filled with the same dust that covered everything, and the door had disappeared, entirely buried beneath a drift that reached almost to the eaves. The barn had collapsed. The structure that had sheltered her grandfather's horses and her father's cattle and her own chickens in the years before the drought, that structure was gone. Only a few broken timbers protruded from the dust, pointing at the sky like the ribs of some enormous animal that had died and been half buried by time. The fence posts that had marked the boundaries of her property were invisible, lost beneath the sea of black powder that stretched in every direction. The dead trees that had once provided shade, the rock outcroppings that had served as landmarks, the dirt road that had connected her farm to the outside world, All of it had vanished. In their place were dunes, smooth, gentle dunes of black dust rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost artistic, almost intentional. The wind had sculpted the landscape like a mad artist, erasing everything that humans had built and replacing it with something strange and terrible and beautiful. Cora turned in a slow circle, looking for anything she recognized. To the east, the church steeple in town was still visible, but it was shorter than it should have been. Either the church had sunk into the earth, or the ground around it had risen, bearing the building up to its bell tower. To the west, where the Henderson farm should have been visible, there was nothing. Just more dunes, more black powder, more evidence of destruction. To the south, a shape that might have been another farmhouse or might have been a natural formation, or might have been her imagination trying to make sense of chaos. To the north, the hill where her grandmother was buried. Cora looked at that hill for a long time. It was still there. Change certainly covered with a layer of black dust like everything else, but still recognizable. Still the place where Martha Branton had been laid to rest, where Ezekiel had joined her, where the three children who had never grown up slept their eternal sleep. The hill had survived, the graves had survived, and so had she. Cora stood on her mound, the only human-made structure, still standing for miles in any direction, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not triumph, not relief, not any simple emotion that could be named. Something more complex, something that encompassed grief for what had been lost, and gratitude for what remained, and determination to build something new from the wreckage. She was alive. She had survived the worst storm in the history of this land, had sat in her underground room and breathed clean air while the surface world choked on its own soil. And now she had work to do. The survivors began appearing on the third day. Cora was on the surface clearing dust from the entrance trench when she saw the first figure emerge from the haze to the east. A shape moving slowly across the black dunes, stumbling, sometimes falling once, but always getting up again, always moving forward, with the desperate determination of someone who had nowhere else to go. She waited, leaning on her shovel, watching the figure approach. It was a woman, young, maybe 25, with a baby wrapped in a dust-caked blanket pressed against her chest. Her face was covered with a rag, but her eyes were visible above it, red and streaming with tears that cut channels through the dirt on her cheeks. The woman stopped at the edge of Cora's mound and looked up at her with eyes that held nothing but desperation. "Please," she said. Her voice was barely audible, a hoarse whisper that spoke of hours or days of breathing dust. "Please, my baby can't breathe. They said there was a place where the air is clean." Cora looked at the baby. It was making small sounds, weak whimpers that seemed to cost it everything it had. Its tiny face was crusted with dried mucus and black dust, and its chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. "Come," Cora said. She led the woman down the entrance trench through the turns into the dugout. The woman stopped just inside the door, her body going still, her eyes widening as she took her first breath of clean air. Then she began to cry. Not quiet tears, not gentle weeping, but deep racking sobs that shook her entire body. She sank to the floor, still clutching her baby, and she cried with the abandon of someone who had given up hope and found it again. "The air," she gasped between sobs. "The air, I forgot what it felt like." Cora knelt beside her and gently took the baby from her arms. She laid the infant on her cot and began to clean its face with a wet rag, wiping away the dust and mucus, clearing its nose and mouth so it could breathe. The baby's cries grew stronger as its lungs filled with clean air for the first time in days. "What's your name?" Cora asked the woman. Sarah Hendricks." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mud across her face. "My husband was in the barn when it collapsed. I tried to find him. I dug for 2 days, but there's so much dust. Everything is buried. I couldn't find him." Cora nodded. She did not offer false hope or empty comfort. She simply continued cleaning the baby, doing the one useful thing she could do. "You can stay here," she said, "as long as you need to." More came after Sarah. They came alone and in pairs and in small family groups, emerging from the devastation like ghosts, drawn by rumors of a place where the air was clean, where a person could breathe without choking, where survival was still possible. An old man named Jeremiah, who had hidden in his root cellar during the storm, but whose cellar had filled with dust when the door collapsed, leaving him to dig himself out with his bare hands over the course of 2 days. A family of five, the Morrisons, who had sealed themselves in their car and run the engine for heat, burning through their gasoline while the storm raged, then walking the 7 miles to Cora's farm when they heard about the dugout. A teenage boy named Daniel, who had been working in town when the storm hit and had sheltered in the church basement, then walked home to find his family's farm erased from the landscape. His parents and sisters vanished beneath the dunes. They came with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the dust in their lungs, in the desperate hope that somewhere someone had found a way to survive. They found Cora. She turned no one away. She could not. These were the people she had known all her life, the neighbors who had waved to her from their cars, the farmers who had traded labor during harvest time, the women who had sat beside her in church and shared recipes and complained about the weather, when weather was something you complained about instead of feared. They were suffering, and she had something that could ease their suffering, and that was all that mattered. The dugout was small, only 8 feet by 10, barely enough room for one person to live comfortably. But comfort had ceased to matter. Survival was what mattered now. And survival meant making room, meant squeezing together, meant sharing the clean air and the cool darkness with anyone who needed it. Cora gave up her cot to the mothers with young children. She slept on the floor, her back against the earthen wall, her body wrapped in a blanket that grew thinner with each passing day. She rationed her water and her food, stretching supplies that had been meant for one person across a dozen, then 2 dozen, then more. And she began to plan. The second room took 2 weeks to build. Cora started excavating on the 5th day after the storm, working alongside the survivors who were strong enough to help. They dug into the earth beside the original dugout, carving out a space 10 feet by 10 feet, large enough to shelter a dozen people if they didn't mind being close. The work was familiar to her now. The rhythm of the pickaxe and the shovel, the way the earth changed as you went deeper, the hard crust giving way to softer soil that remembered what moisture felt like. But this time she was not working alone, and the company made the work bearable in ways she had not expected. They talked while they dug, shared stories of where they had been when the storm hit, what they had lost, who they were looking for. They talked about the lives they had lived before the dust, the farms they had worked, the families they had raised. They talked about the future, about what they would do when the rain came back, about the seeds they would plant and the homes they would build. They talked about hope, and in talking about it, they began to believe in it again. The ceiling was a problem. There was no wagon bed to form the roof, no 4-inch oak planks to hold back the weight of the earth. Cora solved it with what she had, salvaging lumber from the collapsed barn, layering boards and sod and dirt, until she had something that would hold. It was not as strong as the original dugout. It would not survive another Black Sunday. But it would keep out the ordinary dust, the daily accumulation that continued to fall even after the great storm had passed. It would provide clean air and shelter for the people who had nowhere else to go. On the day they finished, the survivors gathered in the new room and stood in silence, breathing the clean air, feeling the cool earth around them. "What do we call it?" Sarah asked her baby, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "The rabbit hole," young Daniel said. "That's what rabbits do, isn't it? They dig down when danger comes. They wait underground until it's safe to come out again." Cora looked at the earthen walls, the salvaged lumber ceiling, the people who had found their way to this place. "The rabbit hole," she said. "That's what we are. That's what we do." Mr. Hadley returned on the 12th of May. Cora was on the surface, checking the ventilation pipes that kept the air moving in the expanded dugout, when she saw him approaching from the direction of town. She barely recognized him. The man who had stood in her yard 3 months ago, with his polished shoes and his clean suit and his certainty about how the world worked, that man was gone. In his place was someone older, thinner, wearing work clothes that were stained and torn, walking with the shuffling gait of a person who had forgotten how to stand up straight. He stopped at the edge of her mound and looked at her with eyes that held no pride, no condescension, no trace of the superiority that had marked every previous encounter. "Mrs. Branton," he said. His voice was hoarse, damaged by weeks of breathing dust. "I heard you were still alive. I came to see for myself." "As you can see," Cora said, gesturing at the mound at the entrance, trench at the signs of life and activity that surrounded her underground home. Hadley nodded slowly. He looked around at the devastated landscape, at the black dunes that covered everything, at the ruins of what had once been farms and homes and lives. "The town is gone," he said. "The bank, the general store, the church, everything. I spent days trying to salvage the records, but they're ruined. The paper turned to mud when the dust got wet. Everything I built, everything I worked for, it's all worthless now." Cora waited. She had learned that sometimes the best response was no response at all, that silence could draw out truths that questions never would. "I've been sleeping in my car," Hadley continued. "It's the only shelter I have. I seal the windows with rags and I sleep sitting up, and I wake up every morning covered in dust anyway. My lungs are getting worse. I can hear them crackling when I breathe. The doctor in town, if you can still call it a town, says I have dust pneumonia, says I need clean air or I'll be dead within the year." He paused, looking at the entrance trench at the door that led down into the earth. "I came to ask if there's room," he said, "for me, just until I can figure out what to do next. I know I have no right to ask. I know what I said to you, how I treated you. But I don't have anywhere else to go." Cora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the day he had come to her farm and offered to take her land for nothing. She thought about the condescension in his voice, the certainty that she would fail the predictions of her death that he had delivered with such casual confidence. She thought about revenge, about the satisfaction of turning him away, of letting him choke on the same dust that he had expected to bury her. Then she thought about Sarah and her baby, about Jeremiah and the Morrisons, about Daniel and all the other survivors who had found their way to this place. She thought about the dugout she had built, the clean air she had protected, the life she had created from nothing but a broken wagon in desperate hope. She had not built this place for revenge. She had built it for survival. And survival meant helping everyone who needed help, even the people who had tried to hurt her. "There's room," she said. "Come down." She led him into the trench, through the turns into the dugout. He stopped just inside the door, the same way everyone stopped, and he took a deep breath of clean air. His eyes closed, his shoulders dropped, and for a moment he looked like a man who had been drowning and had finally found the surface. "My God," he whispered. "The air. I forgot what clean air felt like." "Sit down," Cora said. "Rest. There's water if you need it." Hadley lowered himself to the floor, his back against the earthen wall. He sat there in silence for a long time, breathing deeply, letting the clean air fill his damaged lungs. "I was wrong," he said finally, "about everything, about the land, about you, about what was possible. I looked at this place and I saw worthless dirt. You looked at the same place and you saw a home." Cora sat down across from him, her own back against the wall. "You saw what you were trained to see," she said. "Dollars and cents, assets and liabilities. You looked at the land and calculated what it was worth in money. But land isn't about money. Land is about belonging. It's about having a place where your bones can rest next to the bones of your family. You can't put a dollar value on that." Hadley was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I suppose you can't." They sat in silence, two people who had been enemies and were now just survivors sharing the same clean air, the same cool darkness, the same hope that tomorrow might be better than today. "How did you know?" Hadley asked eventually. "How did you know this would work when nothing else did?" Cora considered the question. She thought about the broken wagon, the empty bank account, and the husband who had abandoned him. Where she thought about the moment when she had looked at the dust bearing everything and decided to bury herself first. I didn't know, she said. I just knew I couldn't keep living above the ground. The surface wasn't working anymore. So I went down. Hadley nodded slowly. The surface wasn't working, he repeated. That's one way to put it. It's the only way to put it, Cora said. When something isn't working, you don't keep doing the same thing and hope for different results. You try something else. You go down instead of up. You let go of what you thought was true and find out what's actually true. She stood up and moved toward the door. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow we start building the third room. We're going to need more space before this is over. The third room was finished by the end of May, and the fourth by mid-June. The dugout complex had grown into something that Cora had never imagined, a network of underground chambers connected by short tunnels, housing nearly 40 people at its peak. They came from all over the county, drawn by the rumors of clean air and survival, and they stayed because there was nowhere else to go. They organized themselves without being told. The strongest took turns digging new rooms and clearing dust from the entrance trenches. The women cooked what food there was and cared for the children. The old people told stories to keep spirits up, tales of other hard times that had been survived, other disasters that had been overcome. They became a community. Not the community they had been before, with its hierarchies and prejudices and careful divisions between those who had and those who had not. This was something different, something that had been forged in the fire of shared suffering. In the dugout, everyone was equal. Everyone breathed the same air. Everyone ate the same food. Everyone depended on everyone else for survival. Cora became their leader not because she sought the position, but because no one else could fill it. She was the one who had built the first room, who had figured out how to survive when survival seemed impossible. She was the one who made the decisions, who settled the disputes, who kept everyone focused on the work that needed to be done. She had never wanted to be a leader. She had only wanted to live. But life had a way of demanding more than you wanted to give, and Cora had learned that you either met those demands or you perished. She met them. The Dust Bowl lasted another 4 years. 4 years of storms and drought and struggle. 4 years of building and rebuilding and building again. The dugout complex grew and changed, rooms added and expanded, systems improved based on hard experience. They learned which angles worked best for the entrance trenches, which materials held up longest against the constant pressure of the earth, which crops could be grown in small plots, protected from the wind. They lost people along the way. The old and the sick, the ones whose lungs had been too damaged by the dust, the ones who simply gave up and stopped fighting. Cora buried them on the hill next to her grandmother, adding new graves to the old ones, expanding the cemetery that had been started by the first Brantons to work this land. But more survived than died, and that was what mattered. When the rains finally returned in 1940, when the clouds opened up and water fell from the sky for the first time in years, Cora was standing on the surface of her mound with her face turned up to the heavens. The drops hit her skin like tiny miracles, each one a promise that the world had not ended, that life would continue, that the future was still possible. The survivors emerged from the dugout and stood in the rain, letting it soak through their clothes, letting it wash away the dust that had coated everything for so long. Children opened their mouths to catch the drops. Adults wept openly, their tears mixing with the rain. Someone started laughing, and the laughter spread until everyone was laughing, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the black dunes and the buried farms and the devastated landscape. The rain was back. The drought was over. The world would grow again. Cora Branton lived until 1978. She was 73 years old when she died peacefully in the same dugout she had built 43 years earlier. The complex had changed over the decades, modernized and expanded, but the original room remained the one with the wagon bed ceiling, the one where she had sat and breathed clean air while the worst storm in American history raged overhead. She had never left the land, even after the rains returned and the dust settled and the farms began to produce again. She had stayed. She had planted the seeds that Esther had given her, the corn and beans and squash that remembered how to grow in hard times. She had rebuilt the farmhouse and the barn. She had raised cattle again and chickens and a garden that produced more vegetables than she could eat. She had married again briefly to a man named Thomas, who had been one of the survivors from the dugout. He had died in 1955, and she had buried him on the hill next to her grandmother, adding another stone to the growing collection. She had never had children of her own, but she had raised dozens of them, the orphans of the Dust Bowl who had no one else to care for them. They called her Grandma Cora, and they came back to visit her every year, bringing their own children and grandchildren, filling the farmhouse with laughter and noise and life. They called her the Mole Woman, not as an insult, but as a title of respect. She was the one who had dug down when everyone else was trying to stand up. She was the one who had listened to the earth instead of fighting it. She was the one who had figured out what the land wanted and had given it freely. When she died, her grandchildren filled in the entrance to the original dugout and planted a pecan tree on top of the mound. The wagon bed was still intact when they did it, the oak planks as solid as the day they had been cut 70 years ago. The wood had been preserved by the constant temperature and low humidity of the underground space, protected from rot and insects by the very earth that had tried to bury everything else. The Historical Society in Oklahoma City has a small exhibit about the Branton dugout, including a cross-section diagram that shows how the wagon bed supported the earth roof and how the baffled entrance prevented dust infiltration. The accompanying text calls it an ingenious adaptation to extreme environmental conditions, which is a formal way of saying that Cora Branton outthought the apocalypse with a broken wagon and a shovel. There is a photograph in the exhibit taken in 1936 showing Cora standing on top of her mound with a group of survivors behind her. She is thin and weathered, her clothes patched and faded, but her eyes are bright and sharp, looking directly into the camera with an expression that seems to dare the viewer to doubt her. Beneath the photograph, there is a quote taken from an interview she gave to a newspaper reporter in 1940. "The surface wasn't working anymore, so I went down. That's all there is to it. When one way of living stops working, you find another way. You don't give up. You don't run away. You dig in and you hold on and you wait for the world to remember what it's supposed to be. That's what people do. That's what the earth does. It remembers. It always remembers." The pecan tree that her grandchildren planted in 1978 is still growing today. It stands on the spot where Cora Branton built her dugout, its roots reaching down into the earth, where the wagon bed still rests its branches, reaching up toward the sky that once tried to bury everything. The tree produces pecans every fall, fat and sweet, and the children of the county climb its branches and fill their pockets and go home to their families, never knowing that beneath their feet, preserved by the earth that their great-great-grandmother loved, the skeleton of a home still waits, still holds, still remembers. If this story of buried resilience found its way into your heart, perhaps there is something in your own life that feels broken beyond repair. A wagon with a snapped axle, a promise that was never kept, a piece of earth that the world has written off as worthless. Look at it again. Look at it the way Cora Branton looked at her broken wagon, not as an ending, but as a beginning, not as something to discard, but as something to build upon. The surface isn't always the answer. Sometimes the deepest wisdom comes from going down.